Hello and welcome to a Promise Scotland podcast, where today we are going to be focusing on the Hearing System Working Group and its process and conclusions. And I'm really delighted today to have Sheriff David Mackie with me just to talk through the work and what it's saying and what we hope it will lead to. So welcome, David. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me along with you.
That's fine.
Delighted
that's fine.
To be here.
It's always slightly funny because we obviously got the train through together as well, so we're not really saying hello for the first time today, but nevertheless, a formal welcome to the podcast. So before we jump into the depths of the work of the Hearing System Working Group and the process it went through and the conclusions that it has reached, could you just tell us a little bit about your professional background and why it was that you were keen to get involved in this work?
Yes, I'm a lawyer and I've followed a very orthodox career. I was a solicitor in general practice. I then went to the bar. I became an advocate, so my focus was on court work, but it was very much civil court work, personal injury. Towards the end of my time at the bar, I was involved in some high court prosecution work, which brought me into contact with the world of criminal law. But then back in about 1999, I became a part-time sheriff, and very soon after that, a full-time sheriff. And since then, I've been a sheriff. I was a full-time sheriff until 2019, and I'm still sitting as a part-time sheriff. But for 15 of those years, I was the sole resident sheriff in Alloa Sheriff Court. Apart from being some of the happiest days of my professional life, it gave me an opportunity to develop my own style of judicial practice.
And in that role, being a sheriff and the primary sheriff in Alloa Sheriff Court, what was your interaction with the children's hearing system in that area in Clackmannanshire? What were you dealing with that was coming through the system, as it were, from the children's hearing system?
The sheriff is part of the children's hearing system. As a sheriff, I would deal with cases where there were disputed grounds for referral. So if the family or anybody disputed the grounds for referral that the reporter was relying on, the children's hearing would send it to the sheriff, and I would have to hear evidence and make a decision whether grounds had been established or not. So that was one type of case. And the other main type of case that would come my way was appeals from the children's hearing. About 4 or 5 times a year, I would have a very challenging task of dealing with applications for child protection orders, almost invariably out of hours, and almost always to make an order to remove a newly born baby from its mother. And I always find that quite challenging. Yeah. So those are the things I did, and it was some of the experiences around that have motivated me to get involved in this project. And
can you tell us a bit more about that? So when you were sitting as a sheriff and we approached you to see if you could be interested in doing this work, what were your experiences that you took from that, of being a sheriff and dealing with appeals and emergency protection orders, that you thought, actually, this is an area of public policy in Scotland. It's a tribunal. It's something that I think does need to change a bit. That there's things that could do with moving here. What was it that you were bringing into this process in terms of your own experience? The
experience of dealing with child protection orders, and I never met the babies. I never met the mothers, but the idea of making an order that would result in a baby being taken away from its mother. At birth, I always found quite challenging, and I always thought there must be a better way to do this. So these sorts of experiences motivated me to become involved. There was one other case which I will mention. I'd been involved in a series of appeals relating to one family, had very complex issues. But at the end of a judgment I wrote, quite a long judgment, I made an observation, because I'd noticed that in this case, over the previous 18 months or 2 years, no less than 50 different panel members and about 21 chairs had been involved in the case. And there'd been no continuity, and I made an observation about the lack of continuity of decision making there, which was striking, because in the world of family law back then, that was about 2012 or 13, there was a growing recognition that there's a huge importance to have continuity of decision making in family matters. Mm-hmm. It was almost more important than expertise. So that was something that struck me and stayed with me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really important segue into the work of the Promise. So, which obviously I was heavily involved in at the tail end of the independent care review, and the Promise itself has a lot to say about the children's hearing system, and it had a lot of commentary around its operating structure and whether or not that was sustainable for going into the future. But quite specifically, it talked a lot about the importance for children and young people and families of consistency of decision making, not just from a case grip perspective and that ongoing holding of someone's story, but also to prevent children, young people, and families from having to retell their stories all the time to a new set of strangers. So, just to give a bit of background on the hearing system working group itself, and then perhaps David, you can take us through a little bit of the process. So, as I said, the Promise had quite a lot to say about the children's hearing system. And then as the Promise Scotland was set up as an organisation, we think very carefully about particular areas that we're going to jump in and do a lot of work around. And it became clear that it was important for us to take on a role in facilitating a redesign programme around the children's hearing system, supporting organisations in and around that to come together and to look at what can change now and should change now, and actually what needs to go on to develop into perhaps more legislative change down the line. So that was brought together with CHS, who recruit, train and retain panel members, and with SCRA, the Scottish Children's Reporters Administration, who hold the administrative function of reporters in Scotland. And through that process and that coming together, we also realised that we needed an independent chair to do that. So you very kindly agreed to take that on, David, with our support. And I just wonder if you could just for those listening into this, could you just tell us? It has been a process that started in October 21 and is going to conclude in May of this year. Could you tell us a bit about what that process has looked like in getting from then to here?
Yes, certainly. As I've said to you many times, when I was invited to do the job, I had this preconceived notion about how these things happen. I thought, well, that's fine. We'll prepare a consultation document and we'll send it out to stakeholders with questionnaires, get the answers and write the report. And that'll be that. But there's nothing like that. What has actually happened has been a process of collaboration. I'll explain more about it in a moment. But I'm a complete convert. It's been fantastic. So we started as a working group. We had some sessions trying to decide or identify what were the main issues that we had to address. And we devised a thing called an issues list. And we had 52, I think, issues that we identified. These are questions, points that we felt had to be addressed by the working group, and that became the focus of our work. But around that, we then started on a process of collaborative design. There were three sort of elements to it. We started right at the beginning with an open kind of webinar for anybody who's interested to participate and get a sense of what the work was going to be. In May last year, there were a number of sessions with particular stakeholder groups who had sessions with the design team. And the design team I'm referring to is the Office of the Chief Designer of the Scottish Government. It's a slightly Orwellian-sounding title, but they are a fantastic group of very energetic and very clued up facilitators. I think there's some quite serious psychology behind this collaborative design concept, but they were fantastic at just getting people to think outside the box, and they worked with those teams of stakeholders. But then perhaps the most important part of this process was that we created 3 design teams. And when you go into one of these design sessions, it's a bit like going into a primary school class. There's stuff on the walls, there's stickies there's plasticine, Lego. But without going into too much detail, they would put a big sheet on the wall with, on the left-hand side, the beginning of the process, and the right-hand side, the end. And so that people didn't feel hidebound to go through a particular chronological process, people were encouraged really just to shout out, what's the most important thing in your mind at the moment? And they would shout out or write it down on a sticky label. And somebody would position it. Now that point comes in at the beginning of the process, so we'll stick it on the wall there. Or this point sits above the whole process, so we'll put it up on the top. And at the end of the session, you would end up with a roll of paper with about 150 stickies on it. And somebody really did roll that up and preserved it. And the second part of the session was usually to take one or two of those ideas and then develop them into prototypes. So that by the end of the day, you would have that roll of paper with all the ideas, but then 2 or 3 particular ideas that had been developed. The key to success of this whole process were the support teams that then took that stuff away and turned it into proper sentences. Yeah. So by the end of that, towards the end of last year, it must have been about October time, I think, we, as a working group, were provided with 150 pages of a bound volume of rich material ideas. There were something like 22 main ideas that emerged from this. And we haven't necessarily accepted all of those. Some we have, some we've, some have prompted some very good discussion and thinking in the team. But that's what we were given with, and the whole process was really very productive, because each of the members of the teams would go back to their respective workplaces and they would talk to their colleagues, and you have this sense that the entire children's hearing community were somehow engaged in this collaboration. I really get that feeling.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, obviously the working group itself is made up of CHS, SCRA and the Promise Scotland and Scottish Government are there as observers. But beyond that, the collaborative redesign project and the engagement activity, there's been engagement with every single professional or a person who engaged with children's hearing system, with various groups of families, with kinship families, foster families, adoptive families, families who've had their children removed, really significant engagement with participative groups of young people with Better Hearings up in Elgin and Murray, and Our Hearings, Our Voice as well, who have done a podcast too. So the level of engagement that this has involved has been really, really significant.
Yes, well, that's absolutely right, because alongside what I've just described as the collaborative design process, there was this regular engagement, meeting all these different groups and participants and actors in the children's hearing system. And one of the most valuable for me personally has been the engagement with young care experienced people, the 2 groups you've mentioned, Our Hearing, Our Voice, and Better Meetings, Murray. I'm not just saying it, that really has been important. Every time I met these young people, every single time, my eyes would be open to some insight or some understanding that would never have occurred to me before, seeing it through their eyes. And that's entirely as it should be. And that has undoubtedly affected my personal thinking on this process, and it feeds through in the work that we're producing. Yeah.
Much of the work that's being produced is about improvement activity that can happen now, and I've certainly seen through this process the amount of work that CHS and SCRA are doing to make change along the way, so that there's not a sense of waiting for this report to land. But I think it's also true to say that there are some really significant findings about how the operating model of the children's hearing system should change going forward. And I just wondered if you might be able to outline just perhaps 3 of those now, so that we can just have a bit of time unpacking why we've got to where we've got to and what change will look like in the future. So I think the first one that we wanted to talk about was this whole concept of a non-adversarial forum and the children's hearing system being inquisitorial in nature. I'll let you just dive straight into that one, David.
Well, I will. I would just remind everyone that the foundation for the children's hearing system is the Kilbrandon report, the Kilbrandon Committee, back in the late 60s, early 70s. And our project of redesigning the children's hearing system is that it's not a dismantling of it, and we're not just holding on to the principles of Kilbrandon, but we're trying to get back to them in a sense. And that idea of a non-adversarial inquisitorial process lies at the heart of it. We heard from many sources that there's concern about the way in which the children's hearing has become quite adversarial in recent years. And it's not surprising. Since Kilbrandon, the European Convention on Human Rights has emerged, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but especially the notion that anybody involved, anybody who's a party to the process is entitled to representation, legal representation if necessary. And that, I think, has fueled some of the adversarialism that's come into the process. So we have sought to take some of the steam out of that by reverting to a process which is much less adversarial and more inquisitorial. And it's quite important to us to be able to call it that. And that holding on to that concept guides our thinking on certain other aspects. So, for example, the idea of taking the adversarial part of any referral, which is the grounds hearing, out of the hearing, is an idea that has emerged and that's formed part of our work. But when we talk about inquisitorial, that suggests that somebody is acting as the inquisitor, and that leads me to the second important, one of the other main themes that has emerged from our work, and that is looking at the role of the chair of the panel.
Yes.
One of the main concerns of young care experienced people was the lack of continuity of personnel in the panel. Not just having to repeat their story every time, but being faced with another group of anonymous adults who are going to make important decisions in their lives was unsettling, and that they were looking for continuity there. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, as a matter of principle, there's a desire for continuity and consistency of decision making in relation to any families. And also a desire for good quality decision making and writing. So in order to address these concerns and this desire for continuity for all these reasons, we found ourselves very easily recognizing that we would need people acting as chairs who could make that commitment. And realistically, the only way people could make that sort of commitment was if it was their job, if they were salaried. And so we find ourselves developing that concept of a salaried chair and a suitably qualified chair. And this is important. One of the challenges for panel members just now is coping with strong advocacy in the room, coping with issues of procedure and sometimes law. And we think that this idea of a stronger chair goes some way to addressing that. And so we're not thinking of any particular profession. We don't think that would be the right way to go. But we do think that the question we should ask is what would be the competencies of a good chair? What would be the attributes of a good chair? And we haven't yet tried to list these, but we imagine that we'd be looking for certain personal qualities of communication, engaging with young people, empathy, compassion, but also professional and tribunal qualities around understanding the whole child protection landscape, legal competence so far as law is an issue, but also that ability to hold the room, that ability to deal with strong voices in the room, to direct an inquiry, because it would become an inquiry into the best interest of the child. And so we find ourselves thinking of a chair and recruiting chairs with those sorts of attributes.
And that is a change, isn't it? I mean, let's be clear about that. There's been I mean, you often remind people that Kilbrandon actually didn't have very much to say about volunteering as a concept in the report.
It's true. I mean, you will look in vain in the Kilbrandon report for any discussion of the decision-making model. How did they arrive at a three-person panel? And they don't actually say it in as many words. I think it is possible to infer that Kilbrandon, the committee, were influenced and impressed by the Scandinavian model of youth panels, which were working very well. That idea of a three-person panel emerged from Kilbrandon. But what's also interesting in Kilbrandon, which I keep pointing out, is that towards the end of the report, sitting in sort of isolation is a paragraph that says that there's an expectation that the panel members would be volunteers, but in the bigger cities, simply to deal with the volume of cases, it might be necessary to think of salaried panel members or salaried chairs. So that idea of remuneration of panel members has been there from the very start, and I think it's right so that we can infer that Kilbrandon wasn't so strongly wedded to the idea of volunteerism, but volunteerism has worked. It's been a very strong element of the children's hearing system and an important element, and that kind of leads me quite nicely to talk about the role of panel members, because the big idea is the salaried chair, but we are continuing to think of the chair being accompanied by two panel members, and we want those panel members to be suitably qualified as well. We wouldn't expect them to have the same breadth of competencies as a chair. And in fact, we see that this as an opportunity to relieve volunteers of the parts of the work that they find most challenging, the procedural aspects, the challenge of dealing with a strong advocacy in the room, and enabling them to focus on what they signed up for, which is to make decisions based on their life experience and their own personal experience in the best interests of children. So, as a matter of simple fairness, it seems that if the chair is being remunerated, then the panel should be too. Yeah. But there's a more important aspect of remuneration of panel members, which is that it offers an opportunity to create perhaps greater diversity amongst panel members. Thankfully, some employers are able to support their employees into being panel members as a part of their career development. So we do have quite a diverse range of panel members now, but there are many panel members who are able to do it because they're fortunate enough not to have to worry about giving up their time to be panel members. But we think that there probably are some people who would like to be panel members who can't because they have work or family responsibilities. And when we speak to young care experienced people about who they'd like to be panel members, I found it quite interesting that they said, yes, it'd be good to have care experienced people as panel members, but that's not the be all and end all. What matters almost more to them is to have panel members that they can relate to, who are younger, who possibly share the same aspirations, same career objectives as they do. And so there's this thought that remuneration of panel members, and possibly coupled with something like more flexible scheduling, might improve the diversity of the volunteer membership of the panels.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's remarkable is that over, since the advent of the children's hearing system, that the system has been able to operate with the volunteering at its core, and that it's been people who've given up their time and to do this work. And it's difficult work. It's really difficult work to make. Yeah. I mean, these are incredibly important decisions that are being made. So I think it's a real credit, I think, to Scotland and the volunteering community that this model has been sustained for so long. But it's also just the right time to really look at it and say, what of this do we want to preserve and keep and enhance? Yeah. And there's much that we want to preserve and keep and enhance, but what do we actually need to shift to make sure that this is a system that's sustainable and a system that is focused primarily on the people that it's for, which is the children and families that appear before it, and that just being a really important pivot point as we implement the promise that this is a moment to make what is a difficult decision, I think, and is a change, but something that needs to happen for the sustainability and the primacy of children's rights of participation in this really important tribunal.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. One other important realization that's emerged from our work is the importance of the child's plan.
Yes.
Because we want to get away from the idea that the children's hearing is somehow a new phase of decision-making in a child's life. It shouldn't be. It should be a continuation of what's gone before. And our report will have a very strong statement at the beginning, quite a long statement, setting the scene and setting the context in which the children's hearing sits. The children's hearing is not the child protection landscape. It is part of it. And the real benefit to children and families could and should happen without a referral to the children's hearing. We don't want the children's hearing to be seen as a last resort, as a signal of failure. A
punishment. Yeah. You're going to the hearing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For some children and families, it is absolutely the right thing to happen and needs to happen. But it should never be seen as a sign of failure or as a last resort. So we would like the idea that children arrive at the children's hearing with a child's plan well developed. It doesn't happen just now, but I think we've recognised the importance of the plan and the importance of developing a plan. And that should run as a golden thread through the whole process, so that instead of being that piece of paper that panel members find at the bottom of the pile and the sheriffs find at the bottom of the pile and they're not really sure what it is, it should sit on top, and their thinking and their decision making should be influenced by what's in the child's plan and how to improve it and make it better. And that same plan should run right through the implementation of any order by the hearing, through to a clear exit. Too many children languish in the children's hearing system, and we've recognised the importance of having a clear exit plan, and that should be part of the child's plan.
Yeah.
So that, if we hold on to that idea of the child's plan, it actually becomes a bit of a glue and a guide to some of the other processes that are taking place. For example, there are often parallel proceedings going on, or processes through the looked after child review or child protection planning meetings and so forth. And we are seeing ways in which the children's hearing can collaborate more with these groups rather than seeing them as some kind of separate process going on independently.
I think that's right. And then I think the question then in relation to the child's plan and what happens at the hearing is what parts of the plan need to become part of the order? What needs to be put on a more solid statutory accountability footing, so we can be clear that those particular aspects are going to receive a level of scrutiny at review hearings and consequent hearings that come afterwards.
That's right.
I think it is probably just important to note at this point that it's fair to say that post-pandemic, the cost of living crisis, what's happening in children and family social work across many public services at the moment is that people in those roles feel pretty scunnered, and that there's a lot of anxiety, I think, about words like accountability and implementation of orders, and a worry that what might happen here might lead to increased scrutiny for a social worker standing in front of a panel. And I just wondered if you wanted to touch on that a little bit, just around about what you're seeking, what you're seeking to achieve when we talk about accountability for a child's plan and a child order. What in your mind would that actually look like and feel like for professionals coming into that room as well?
Yes. Well, this is an area where it's a brilliant example of how we've learnt from engagement with groups. We've learned so much from talking to social workers alongside the collaborative design process that we've been undertaking. Too often, social workers find themselves as the target of criticism if an order is not being implemented or it's, for some reason it's gone wrong. But very often it's because of a lack of resources, or because some other agency, such as health, hasn't met the need that was identified by the Children's Hearing. And so, as a result of these conversations and thinking around this issue, we've been looking for more collaborative ways to address problems when they arise. I mentioned looked after care reviews. These are multidisciplinary groups of experts. They're usually a pretty talented group who are there as a potential resource. And we see the opportunity here of the Children's Hearing drawing on that expertise when a problem arises. I think it's important to set the scene slightly. I'll try not to get too technical about accountability, but at the moment, in the current system, the main way in which implementation authorities are held to account is through the national convener. He has a role in, and I think it's called enforcement. That's the expression that's used in the legislation. So he has a process that he can start to enforce an order. But it's a bit cumbersome, it's a bit heavy-handed, and doesn't necessarily meet the immediate needs of a child whose order is going wrong.
Absolutely.
So we've identified a need for a more immediate response, a more flexible response to situations where orders are not going well or where there are difficulties. And so we imagine creating a process whereby the child, the family, or others, teachers, health workers, could draw to the attention of the chair a situation that might not be working very well, and the chair having a discretion to decide whether to do anything, whether the situation can be resolved by some emails and correspondence, or whether it's sufficiently important to necessitate a review hearing and for calling for a review. And as part of that process, we imagine the hearing being able to draw on that expertise that might lie elsewhere in, for example, the looked after care review. And developing, therefore, a more collaborative approach to dealing with problems. And the social worker, instead of becoming the target for the ire of the panel members, might then become more of a conduit of the thinking from the looked after care review. The resource in question might not be available, so they'll find a workaround. The availability of that resource is something that can be dealt with elsewhere by the national convener.
Yeah, and I think it's also been important to restate legislative duties that are already there. So there's already an expectation that implementing authorities will work on a multi-agency basis.
Yes.
There's already a duty to collaborate with other agencies. So there's a bit about this that actually isn't within the remit of the Children's Hearing System, but is in broader work to not just keep the promise, but in broader public services improvement space about how do we just keep driving at that multi-agency working, keep resourcing and supporting early intervention and support, and keep ensuring that our governance frameworks are able to pick up and catch problems and difficulties quickly. Now, I think what we'd hope is that this work feeds into that. It isn't the answer to that huge question, which is a really significant question, but it is something that we're expecting there to be a bit more tangible accountability for the children who are living in the care system, which is absolutely critical.
Yes, well, that's absolutely right. We are recognising that there's an opportunity here to create a better system for gathering information, gathering data, and feeding it into bigger decision-making, policy-making, budget decisions, that sort of thing. Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, I think that is probably going to come to the conclusion of our conversation, David, and the things that you wanted. Is there anything that we've not touched on that you'd like to raise?
Not really.
We could dive deep into lots of other bits, couldn't we?
We could go deeper into it and we could talk for hours. But I think we've done quite well to show how this process has worked and how these big key elements are influencing our thinking on some of the detail. So I think that covers it quite well.
Just to finish up, David, do you is your hope for what a children's hearing system will feel like for children and families going through it? Once the improvement activity is happening, once some legislative change has shifted, for future children who we hope don't have to touch the children's hearing system, but we know will do at some stage in their lives, what do you hope it will feel like for them to go through it?
We will never get away from the strong feelings that these issues raise. But I think we can do a lot to create a process that is much more inclusive, that instead of the children's hearing being like a courtroom, that will be more of a conversation with the family and social workers and others who might have a word or views to express on it, to arrive at the best decisions for children. It would be hard to say it will ever be a pleasant process, but I think I would like to think of it as a process that would never be hostile, that children would feel comfortable in, that children will understand and follow, and that they won't be confused by. And a system that will lead to decisions that are clear. I mean, we could drift into the whole issue of childcare and so forth, which is not our role. But I would like to think that decisions by the hearing would lead to much more satisfactory outcomes, fewer movements of placements, greater certainty for children in their futures and their lives, their whole lives. But that's at the key of it. At the heart of it is the experience of the children and the certainty and security that I hope that would bring.
Thank you. Thanks for that, David. And also just wanted to say, certainly on behalf of the Promise Scotland, and I'm sure CHS and SCRA and all the other organisations and people that have engaged in this work, thank you for the inordinate amount of time that I think when we first met, I told you this might be maybe a meeting a week, and I patently lied at that point. So thank you for your ongoing involvement and just the commitment that you've brought to this work. It's hugely appreciated.
It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be involved in it. Been very happy to be involved. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And obviously we'll keep going with other Promise Scotland podcasts about key areas of work, so do keep giving in your feedback and thoughts. They're always very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much.